The bottom of Mem Aleph is 41b. Okay, just to summarize from yesterday, Mem Aleph from this bottom of the page. We're at four lines to the bottom of the page. Elamas Nisan. But to summarize, the Mishnah talks about a chatzi eved chatzi ben chayron, somebody who's half a free man, half slave. And we had a debate yesterday between Rebbe and the Chachamim. Rebbe says you could make somebody you could free somebody halfway, and the Rabbanan say you can't. And we had a major debate what exactly the scenario was. According to the first version, everybody holds that you can free somebody halfway through monetary redemption. In other words, if the slave redeems himself halfway, he's a half slave, half free man. But the debate is whether the master can free him with an emancipation document halfway. That is a debate between Rebbe and the Chacham. According to the second version of Rav Yosef, it's the opposite. So everyone agrees that with the document you cannot free half the slave. However, the Rabbanan say, the debate is with regard to money. Can he redeem himself halfway? According to the final analysis of the Gemara, actually Rabbi Yosef holds the debate is both with regard to a document and with regard to money. In both instances, Rebbe says you could redeem, he could be freed halfway, and the Rabbanan say he cannot. Now, accordingly, the question is, what's going to happen in our Mishnah? Our Mishnah talks about a chatzi eved chatzi ben chayron. According to Rabbah, this makes a lot of sense. It's talking about money, and he can redeem himself halfway, according to all opinions. According to Rav Yosef, it would seem that our mission is going according to Rebbe. Rebbe says that it's possible to free a slave halfway, and not according to the Rabbanon, who say it's impossible.
What about page position, please?
Second to last word on Mem Aleph from the base, 41b.
41b.
Ravina, now we're 42a. We're talking about where this is the initial scenario I explained when we learned the Mishnah, which is that actually two people own the slave in partnership, and one partner frees half. In other words, the entire debate between the Rebbe and the Rabbanan, it's only when somebody does not release his complete ownership, if such a thing is possible. In other words, can you release partial ownership of an event, or must it be done unilaterally? However, with regard to two partners, each one of them could release his entire ownership, in which case the man will be halfway free. Amar Rabba, Machlais b'shechur chatziev, hiniyah chatziev. Aval shechur chatziev umachar chatziev anos matona chatziev kivin nekanafik minei kulay divrei kol kana. According to Rabba, everybody agrees that even if you could free a slave halfway, that's only where you kept the other half for yourself. But once you transfer the other half, then the eved acquires himself completely. Wait, 1 second. Okay. And the idea here in general is that because owning a slave has a religious component, it's very, in general, the whole idea that you could free half a slave is a bit difficult to understand, how you can cut a religious ownership, the religious aspect of the ownership. Rob is pointing out that even if you could, that's only when you keep the other half for yourself. Once you transfer the other half, effectively the slave acquires himself completely. Borrow the article for a second. See if we get a better explanation here about why this is the case. The idea is as follows. The idea here is as follows. It's it's the opposite. So in other words, what's going on here is as follows. The Rabbanan say that you need to divest completely of the slave, and that's why you can't free half a slave. However, let's say you did it anyway. You freed half a slave, but then you sold the other half. So now you've divested completely from it. In that case, the slave acquires the first half. As the rabbis typically say, you can't free half a slave. But let's say you freed half a slave and then you sold the other half. That would be valid. The slave would acquire half of himself.
So rather, you're saying in that circumstance, then the slave is effectively rendered free?
No, half free, half slave.
Monetarily is he free, religiously he's not, or is he half
Yeah,
monetarily and half
so
religiously?
in other words, the idea is as follows: just like if you have two partners, one partner could completely free him.
Right.
And now, if you weren't two partners, according to the Rabbanan's opinion, you can't free him. Why not? Because you cannot free him halfway, because you didn't divest entirely from him. So Rava says that would be true when you keep half of him for yourself. But where the other half is sold, then he does acquire that half, the half that you initially freed him. So you freed him halfway, according to the Rabbanan.
One half got freed by one guy. And
No.
No.
There's only one owner. Where there's two owners, everybody agrees that if one owner divests whatever he owns, which is half, then he becomes half free man, half slave.
All right.
Is he put on to fill in every other day?
We'll get to that. That's subject for today and a little bit tomorrow as well.
Well, then what are we talking about here?
We're talking about a scenario where he's owned by one person. The Rabbanan say if you're owned by one person, you cannot be freed halfway. Why can't you be freed halfway? Because he hasn't divested from the slave completely. However, how about this? He says, I'm freeing you halfway, and the other half I'm selling to somebody else. So in this case, he is divesting his complete ownership. In that case, the slave could acquire half of himself. And now he becomes half slave, half free man. Together?
Yes.
Say that at the beginning.
Abhaya. Feel free to stop me today. I don't, it's difficult tomorrow. I'm not sure I myself understand it. Amrli Abhaya, as it just saw. Amrli Abhaya, ubekulai loy pligi. Is there not a debate with regard to somebody who frees his entire slave? We'll explain. That we have one Bryce that says, Hakoitzev nechosav l'shnei avodav, somebody who gifts all of his assets to two of his slaves, so including themselves. So kanu, they acquire their assets. Umeshachar and zezeh. Now these two people are sort of partners in each other, so they have to free each other. V'tanya idach, another brayse says, "So I'm a call nichsein esuna lepleni abdi, af atzman loikanu." The guy says, "All my assets should belong to these two people. They don't even acquire themselves." So it seems to be a contradiction. The Gemara here is going to, next 10 minutes, we'll discuss a bunch of resolutions to try to resolve this question. What's the question? A guy gives everything he owns to two slaves, including themselves. One brayse says that they do acquire themselves and they each have to write out a shichur to each other. And another brayse says that it doesn't work. The king does not work. Okay. My love, Abaye suggests what's the resolution of the two brayses? Harabi v'harabanon. One brayse says Rabbi, one brayse says the Rabbanon. Accordingly, according to Rabbi, according to Rabbi, we know that if you give, the guy gave both of his slaves everything, so they acquire themselves each one halfway, and they have to free each other. According to the Rabbanon, even if you give completely, in other words, you've completely given what you own half to each slave, that's also not valid. Because there's no such thing as giving a half a slave. So that proposition stands in contrast to Rabbah that we just saw. Rabbah says no. Rabbah says if you gift halfway, then you could free a slave halfway. Over here, it's the same scenario. You're gifting half to one slave, freeing the guy halfway to the other slave. And the Rabbanan still say, purportedly, or allegedly, that it does not work. So you have a contradiction. We together in the contradiction? Very simple. You give everything you own to two slaves, which effectively means you're giving half to each side. One brayse says they free each other and it's fine. The other brayse says it doesn't work. Okay. So Abaye proposes, this is a debate between Rabbi and the Rabbanon. And of course, the Gemara says, loy, not necessarily. Both opinions could be the Rabbanon. So why, if you give it, why does one brayse say that you can give everything you own to two slaves and they free each other, i.e. it works? If you give everything you have to both people, so then you haven't left anything behind for yourself, and therefore each one owns half and they free each other. However, if you give half to each side, so you're unable to give half to each side because you're unable to free a slave halfway, and therefore it doesn't work. One second. Yeah, see, Rashi explains he wrote a document to each one to each one, with each document saying, I give you half of my assets. Now, because you can't free a slave halfway, the Rabbanan say it's not valid. And Rashi points out, obviously, the way to do this, you can do two documents simultaneously. You just have one person acquire it on behalf of both of them at the same moment. Okay. So the Gemara says, V'miditoni seifa, if you look at the end of that brayso, if he says, I'm giving each one half, he does not acquire. In other words, the brayso says he gives if he gives both slaves half of his assets, if he gives both slaves his assets, it does not work. They do not go free. And if he said halfway, they also don't go free. Then what does that mean? That means the first scenario is not where they said halfway, chatzi, half to each one. Mechal de Reisha, the Amar Kulei, where he said, I'm giving everything to each slave, and yet it still doesn't work. So the Gemara says, no, Pirush Kamefarish. The brayso is explaining itself. What does the brayso say? You give something to both slaves. Af atzman loikanu. They don't even acquire themselves. Kate said, how is that possible? He go into Amar chatzi, where he says, you got half, you got half. because he's freeing, emancipating each slave halfway, according to the Rabbanan, you can't do that. Therefore, it does not work, and they do not acquire themselves. This makes sense. The Okay, so now the Gemara is trying, the Bryce again, what does the Bryce say? The Bryce says you free two slaves, doesn't work. They don't acquire themselves. You free half, also doesn't work. Proposes the Gemara, it's actually one statement. How did you free each slave? Or you said half. But if you said I'm giving everything to each slave, that is not a shiur. There's no shiur. That's the operative word here. The critical concept here is shiur. What does a shiur mean? You left something behind. And the critical idea is there's no such thing as freeing half a slave. Why? Because you keep the other half. So if you give the slave completely, that's fine. In other words, if the guy sells a slave to two partners, that's fine. But where he gives half the slave to the slave, that doesn't work. Which is what's going on here. You say half, that means you're keeping the other half, and therefore it's not valid. Effectively, it's a half of a freedom. Okay. Now, the Gemara tries to prove that it must be the Bryce is actually one statement of where he gave each slave half of himself, which is not valid according to the Rabbanan, because according to the Rabbanan, you need to free completely. The Isai declaration Amar Kulai, Hashta Amar Kulai Lekano Amar Chatzi Chatzi Mibai. So the Gemara tries to prove, in other words, if you say the Bryce is making two different statements, one where he said, I'm giving everything to each slave, and it still doesn't work. And the second scenario of the Bryce is, and even if he gives half to each slave, it doesn't work. There's no even there. In other words, if you think that if he gives everything to both slaves, which means he kept for himself 0 at the moment of Kinyan, he never gave half of a slave. If that doesn't work, certainly if he gives half to each slave, for sure that wouldn't work. Because in that case, he's only freeing half a slave. It's not unilateral. So there's even less of a reason to work. So if it says kula, obviously no chatzi chatzi. So the Gemara says that's not a good proof. That's not a good argument, because Tana Seifel, Glu Resha. The reason why you're right, it's not an even, but it's necessary to know what the first part of the Mishnah is. In other words, it's necessary to know that the first part of the Mishnah is it is necessary to know that the first part of the Mishnah. One second here. That the first part of the Mishnah is. Give me a second here. It is necessary to know that the first part of the Mishnah is talking about kulai by telling me that the second part is chatzi chatzi. So therefore, it would make sense that the Mishnah would give you the big chiddush first, which is kulai, and then the smaller chiddush of chatzi chatzi afterwards, because the chatzi chatzi tells me the first part of the Mishnah is kulai. So that's not a good argument. In other words, of your own accord, you can argue that it's actually one statement. The Mishnah is not talking about the Bryce is not talking about kulai; it's only talking about half chatzi chatzi. And chatzi chatzi is not a unilateral transaction, and that's why it doesn't work. That's fine, but there's no proof to this. Shalaytimers, you shouldn't think reish damer chatzi chatzi. Amar kulay konaton. A sefer damer chatzi chatzi. Called the reish damer kulay, which is how we explained it. Okay. If you lucky like konaton, the say okay. So the first proposal is that what's the difference in the two Bryces? Bryce number one that says you give two slaves and it works. Each one acquires himself is where you gave everything to both slaves. Bryce number two that says it doesn't work. Actually, the Bryce itself explains why doesn't it work? Because you gave half to each one, i.e., not a unilateral gift. Okay. Another possibility, it's not difficult. Depends if you use one document or two documents. Okay. 1 second. Okay. And the critical idea here is that that one document does not work for two slaves. Why not? Because an emancipation is compared to divorce, and each woman requires their own divorce. Therefore, each slave requires their own document as well. Okay, if that's the case, my area then why does the Brisa mention chatzi? The point here is not chatzi. The point is that you use two documents. Samar says you're right. Af atzma loikanu. Okay, in other words, the Brisa ends by saying that if he said chatzi chatzi, it doesn't work. But if you say chatzi chatzi, it doesn't work anyway. It doesn't work regardless because you didn't give a unilateral freedom. This is what he means to say. If you give each one half, doesn't work. That's true even in one. That's true. Sorry. First scenario of the Mishnah of the Brisa. If you said to each slave, I'm giving you everything, but you wrote it out in one document. You don't acquire yourself. But when is this true? If you wrote it in one document. Why? Because you can't divorce two slaves with one document. And that's why even though you said kulai, you did free them unilaterally, it still doesn't work. Because you can't free two slaves in one document. But if you wrote it in two documents and you free both slaves unilaterally, then kanu, they do acquire themselves. But if you don't free them unilaterally, even if you use two documents, nami lekanu, they also don't acquire themselves. That's the second resolution. We get to the end. I'll just summarize this. But let's continue. Third resolution. This is not easy. You're saying anyone saw last night. Very, very difficult. We'll summarize a moment. Let's just finish this. This is not easy. Third possibility. It's also not difficult. Why? This is the most. This I would say is the most obvious one, which is that in both scenarios he said, "I'm giving you everything."
That makes
It depends if it happened at the same time or one after another. Okay, so Gemara will explain it. Okay, so what happened was the guy gave all of his assets to the first slave. Then he gave all of his assets to the second slave. I understand why the second slave doesn't work. It's too late, right? You can't give it. This is an Indian giver, right? You can't give something you don't have. Why does the first guy not work? In other words, they gave everything to the first slave, so why doesn't he acquire himself plus everything else? So Gemara says, you're right, this is not a good answer. This resolution is not valid. The resolution is an invalid resolution. Okay, we're not done yet. These three were anonymous. Now we have Rav Ashi Amar. Rav Ashi has another possibility. Okay. Rav Ashi here is trying to justify the third answer. The third answer is whether it happened at the same time or one after another. One after another doesn't work. The question is, why doesn't the first guy acquire his freedom? What's wrong? Why didn't the first guy acquire his freedom? So Rav Ashi Amar Shani Hasan to Karle Avdi. 1 second. Sorry. Hold on. No. Rashi. I'm sorry. Rashi learns differently. It's confusing here. So, according to Rashi, Rav Ashi is making the following statement. His proposal is the reason why it doesn't work is because you wrote in the document Avdi, my slave. In other words, you're making the guy a free man and you're calling him a slave. Therefore, the document is not valid. Amalei Rafram to Rav Ashi. So Rafram says to Rav Ashi, maybe he means the fact that you were my slave. And I have another example of something similar. Where similar concept would be valid. Mila Tanan, do we not have the halacha as follows? Somebody gives all of his assets to his slave, the slave goes free. Let's say he says, I'm giving you everything except for a certain size piece of land, but he doesn't tell him what size piece of land. So what effectively happens here? He doesn't own any piece of land, because every piece of land he could say, this is the one I left over. And because the land doesn't work, because you can always point to a piece of land and say, this is the one I left over. So therefore, actually, the slave doesn't acquire himself either. Because the document is sort of just a deceitful document. Reb Shimon says, he's always free. If he says, I'm giving everything to this slave, again, he calls him a slave here, except for 1/10,000th, which is sort of a derogatory reference. The slave is worth 1/10,000th of all his assets. Okay. Let's say he said, I'm giving everything I own to Pliny, my slave. It would still work, it would work, and the slave would acquire his freedom. Why is that the case? But he called him my slave. Ella, what does a slave mean? Ella the fact that you were my slave, not that you are my slave. So therefore, the fact that he calls him a slave, that doesn't prove that he still is a slave. It could mean that he was my slave, and that's why he's being titled the word slave. Okay, so let's just summarize here. We have a contradiction. We have a statement. Begin initially. We have a statement from Rabbi, which is really the trigger of this whole discussion. How did Rabbi trigger us? Rabbi made the following statement. He said, according to the Rabbanon, let's take a step back. The Gemara proposed the explanation of our mission. How is it possible to be a half slave? 2 partners. Why is it necessary to have 2 partners? Because you must free, according to the Rabbanon's opinion here, you must free a slave unilaterally. There's no such thing as retaining half ownership. Says Rabba, according to the Rabbanon, that you can't free your slave halfway. Let's say you did it, and then you sold him, then he goes out free halfway, because then you've unilaterally released yourself from that slave. The Gemara tried proposing a question against Rabbah, but really a question in general. A contradiction between 2 brises. One brise says you give all your assets to 2 slaves, they acquire their freedom. And another brise says they do not acquire their freedom. Contradiction. How do we resolve the 2 brises? So we had 3 different resolutions here. Resolution number 1 was, it depends if you gifted them entirely by saying kulai, you gifted everything you had to both slaves, or you gave half to each one. Or you give half to each one, it's not a unilateral gift, and therefore the slaves do not acquire their freedom. Another possibility was, the operating question was whether or not you used 1 document or 2 documents. What's wrong with using 1 document? Well, it doesn't work to use 1 document. It's just a law. That's the law, and it's learned from a divorce. You can't divorce 2 women in 1 document either. And the third possibility was, depends if it happens simultaneously or one after another. The Gemara, however, does not understand how one after another, why if you give it to one slave after another slave, the first slave does not acquire his freedom. The Gemara releases that resolution, and it remains unresolved, according to that theory.
You mean just because?
What was that?
Because.
What do you mean because?
Well, can't you do something because? He's asking,
Okay.
one comment.
He's doing
You because.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah. And the 4th resolution was a resolution of Rav Ashi. It was because he used the title of slave in the document of freedom, and the Gemara again points out that this is not a valid argument. Okay. Now we go to a little bit of your questions. A little bit of point that Jared raised earlier. What happens if something happens to him on the day that he's a slave? So remember, the opinion of Beis Hillel is that half the time he's a slave, half the time he's a free man. Eventually, Beis Hillel agreed to Beis Shammai and that he was wrong, and that we forced the master to free him. Okay. Now we're on Nokche Shor Yom Shel Rabbi LeRabbi. 5 lines in the bottom of the page. Nokche Shor Yom Shel Rabbi LeRabbi. A ox gores him the day that he belongs to the master. So then the payment goes to the master. Yom Shel Atzim, the day he belongs to himself. So then the payment goes to himself. Okay. So Gemara says, El Me'at, if that's the case, Yom Shal Rabba Yisa Shifcha, Yom Shal Atzma Yisa Bascharen. Maybe that he can marry a maidservant the day that he belongs to the master, and the next day he can marry a free man when he belongs to himself. So Gemara says, Isur like Hamrina. We're arguing this in monetary terms, not in terms of Isser. In terms of Isser, obviously, it would always be the same. And therefore, in truth, the guy is stuck. He can't marry a free man, he can't marry a maid, can't live with a maidservant either. Toshma, him is Mishachetzi Eved v'Chetzi ben Chorin. Somebody kills somebody who's half free man, half slave. Okay, now the rule is as follows. We're talking here about a Shor HaMuad. Let's just say this is the type of animal that if it gores, it's liable to pay. The halacha in that situation is if it kills a slave, the guy pays 30 coins. If it kills a free man, it pays the guy has to pay kaifer. What is kaifer? Kaifer is a payment that equals the value of the dead person. So over here, who gets him? So Gemara says very interesting. What happens? He pays half a knas of 30 coins, which means he pays 15 coins to the master, and he pays the half of the guy's value to the guy's inheritors. Because half slave, half free man.
So did he have inheritors?
Maybe
I mean,
he wrote a will. I don't know. It's a good question.
On the days free, does he have?
That's a very good question. I think maybe he wrote a will or something. That's the best I can.
But like you say like if he's free, once he's free, that
still can't get married.
But
If he got married, could be got married anyway.
like so,
He lived with a woman anyway, because you don't have to. Your children inherit you whether or not they're born in wedlock. So it could be he had a relationship with.
but like a gear is there's no relatives. So once he's free, does he have relatives, or is he without relatives? Is he without inheritors? And on the day that he's free,
He has relatives from his mother's side, not his father's side.
that become on me?
If he has no living relatives, the quote unquote state, so to speak, it goes to the state, in this case, the dental fund, or?
So it's a good question. So you have to realize that no relatives means no relatives
zero.
completely. That means that all of his relatives were either non-Jewish. Let's say, for example, he's a new slave who because a slave also has to go sort of a conversion process to become a slave. So if all his relatives are converted and they're all dead, then it would go to whoever wants to take it.
Free.
In this case, the guy wouldn't make the payment because the guy himself acquires it. In other words, the owner of the ox is basically going to refuse payment. I acquired the payment I was obligated to make. Okay. The Chatzi Kaifer Liyarshiv, we're on top of Membez and Membez. So Gemara says, Amai, why is this the case? Why don't we say that depends when he was gored, when he was killed? If he was killed the day that he was a slave, then 30 coins should go to the master. If he was killed the day he was a free man, his inheritors should get the entire amount of kaifer. So Gemara says, obviously you can't do that. He killed somebody. There's no half and half anymore. He's dead. So therefore we have to split up half of the value. Half of it goes to the master as a knas, 15 coins, half of 30, and half of the kaifer, which means half the value of his body, of himself, is going to go to his inheritors. So what's an example of a damage where there is no permanent loss? So Gemara says, where he hit him on his hand and his hand dries up. But eventually it will get better. So in other words, if an animal injures him on the day of his master, but it's an injury that's temporary, it takes him away from work. So there it makes a difference. Okay, now let's just go into a side point here. There's a very big difference here between when a human being hurts somebody else, injures somebody else, battery, assault, these type of violations. That in Hebrew is called chayvel. When an animal damages, that's called nezek. There are massive differences between chayvel and nezek. Okay, nezikin is value, which means if an animal injures somebody, we look at the difference in value. How much was the guy worth in the slave market then and now? With a human being, we count other components. We count nezek then and now, but we also count what's called sheves. Sheves is that he's so ill that he couldn't even do menial labor. In other words, the proposal of menial labor is a cucumber watchman. All he needs to do is like shake some leaves when an owl comes to take, or when not an owl, whatever, a vulture, bird, whatever it is, tries to steal some cucumbers. He's sort of, pushes the pedal of the scarecrow. That's a shema kashulan. So in other words, that labor he can't do while he's tremendously ill. Now let's say he was a skilled craftsman. Let's say he was what's the most skilled craftsman? The driller of pearls. We spoke about him a couple of times. The guy who drills pearls, incredibly skilled craft. Now, if he can't drill pearls anymore, that means his value is depreciated. You're paying for him in the depreciation of value. But also the fact that he's injured and in bed means that he can't wash cucumbers. You pay for that too. That's only by chayvel. But in Zikin, there's no such payments. Abaya posits as follows. Abaya says when there's temporary damage of chayvel, there's two payments to be made. Number one is in the slave market, you're selling a guy who will be a slave in 8 weeks, because until 8 weeks he's going to be in the hospital. He's worth less, right? And you're paying Shevis Katana. You're paying the fact that the guy can't even serve as a cucumber watchman for 8 weeks. That's because he's stuck in bed. That it makes sense. Rava says that Shevis is one payment. In other words, according to Rava, somebody who's going to get better, there is no depreciation in value, even they can't use the guy for the next 8 weeks. That's not called depreciation. Instead, what we do is we say, look, what's your salary as a pearl driller for the next 8 weeks? I don't know, $1,000 a day. So this is $1,000 a day for the next 8 weeks. That's what you have to pay, because there was no permanent damage, because you'll be able to drill pearls in 8 weeks again. Okay, if that's the case, now this is a payment of chayvel. An animal is zikin, you don't pay for that. So even if the animal harms him, you wouldn't pay shevis. Sharhu, b'sharin and mishalom al nezek. Shar only pays nezek. So what's an example? Again, according to Rava, of nezek, of a nezek payment, which is not a permanent payment. In other words, the guy isn't permanently damaged. The Gemara says simple solution. Kishiko adam, drop the animal. It's where a person hit him. He's gonna get better in 8 weeks. He has to pay shevis. So if he hit him on the day of his master, the shevis goes to his master. The payment for not being able to work. If he hit him on the day that he owns himself, he pays him for him. He pays the slave himself, the half slave, the half free man. Remember the Rava lois. This, it could be that Rava just disagrees with this entire statement. Okay, continue here tomorrow.
Not sure.
Okay.